We're diving into a really big question today. How does an idea that's hotly debated and, super controversial eventually become a sacred truth for millions? We're about to look at one of the most powerful examples of this in all of history.
All right, welcome back, everyone. This is part 4 of our deep dive into the human and philosophical origins of the Trinity. Now, if you're just joining us, you've picked a heck of a time to jump in, because this is the moment where everything changes. The debate is about to spill out of the churches and right into the emperor's court.
So that's the big question we're tackling, right? How did an idea that people were fiercely arguing over become the official state-enforced doctrine of the entire Roman Empire? I mean, think about that. It's this incredible story where philosophy, politics, and raw power all collide.
Okay, so to really get how one single doctrine came out on top, you've got to understand the scene. We have to picture the battlefield of ideas. Because the early Christian world, well, it wasn't this place of peaceful, unified belief. No way. It was a chaotic, loud, and incredibly intense arena of competing ideas.
So, one of the first big players on this battlefield was a movement called Gnosticism. The core idea for a lot of the Gnostics was that the physical world, matter, our bodies, was fundamentally flawed, maybe even evil. And you can see how this creates a massive theological headache, right? If Jesus is supposed to be divine and perfect, how could he possibly have a real physical human body? Some Gnostics came to the conclusion that he only seemed to be human. And that, of course, was a huge challenge to what many other Christians believed.
And like a pendulum swinging back, you get a reaction to Gnosticism. This new movement, Monarchianism, pops up. Their whole thing was fiercely defending the idea that God is absolutely one, a single ruler, a monarch, right? It was a direct counter to Gnosticism. But here's the twist. In trying to fix that problem, they came up with their own new ideas about Christ that, you guessed it, were also eventually rejected. It's like the cure ended up being just as controversial as the disease.
And this really highlights something crucial about this whole period. You might imagine these debates as one single, established, correct belief fighting off a challenger. But that's not what the history shows us. It was way messier. It was often a clash between multiple, competing schools of thought, and pretty much everyone was pointing fingers, accusing everyone else of being wrong.
This theological chaos could have just kept simmering for centuries. Who knows? But then, something completely unexpected happens. An outside force, a real game changer, steps into the ring, the Roman emperor himself. And Constantine's decision to get involved, well, it was going to change everything.
So you gotta ask, why would a Roman emperor care about a Christian debate? Was he a theologian? Not really. The motivation here seems to be way more political. Constantine's empire was a mess. It was fractured, and he saw a unified Christianity as a powerful tool, like a kind of social glue to hold the whole thing together. Simple math for him, a unified church equals a unified empire.
And to force that unity, Constantine does something huge. He calls a council. In the year 325, bishops from all over are summoned to a city called Nicaea, and they have a crystal clear order from the emperor. Figure it out, vote, come up with one single official definition of God. Just one tiny problem. The bishops themselves were worlds apart on the issue.
The whole argument really boiled down to two main figures, two opposing views. On one side, you had a guy named Arius. His logic was pretty straightforward. A son has to come after his father, right? So he argued Jesus must have had a beginning. He was a special, unique creation of God, but a creation nonetheless. Then, on the complete other side, you have Athanasius. He argued, no, the Father and the Son are made of the exact same stuff, the same substance. They've both existed forever. These were the two magnetic poles of the entire debate.
Now, it's really easy for us to look back and think this was a simple 50-50 split, but the reality on the ground was way more complicated. And here's the shocker. When all the bishops actually got to Nicaea, neither Arius' side nor Athanasius' side had anywhere near a majority. In fact, the view that would eventually become the Trinity was held by a tiny minority. Most of the bishops were actually somewhere in the middle, holding a different view entirely.
Just look at this. It lays out the stunning reality of the situation. The Athanasians, the guys whose view eventually won the day, they were a really small minority. The Arians, their opponents, also a small group. The vast majority of the bishops there, they were part of this big, moderate middle party. It's kind of wild when you think about it. The two loudest, most extreme positions were held by the smallest factions in the room.
And who's watching over this whole thing? The emperor. And by all accounts,
He knew very little about the intricate theology and probably cared even less. He wasn't on a quest for divine truth. He was on a quest for a decision, any decision. He just wanted it settled so he could have his unified church. So with all that imperial pressure bearing down, the council eventually sided with Athanasius and his minority viewpoint. Unity was achieved, or at least it was on paper.
But as you can probably guess, a vote forced by an emperor doesn't just magically change what people believe deep down. The decision at Nicaea didn't end the conflict. If anything, it poured gasoline on the fire. It absolutely ignited it. The decades that followed were some of the most violent, chaotic, and brutal in the church's entire history.
I mean, just look at the timeline for the next 50 years or so. It's dizzying. In 325, Nicaea makes the Athanasian, or Trinitarian view, official. Okay, but then, just over 3 decades later, another council, this one with even more bishops, completely reverses that decision. And then, in 381, yet another council flips it right back again, and that's the one that stuck. Can you imagine the doctrinal whiplash? It was just back and forth, back and forth.
And let's be clear, this wasn't just some polite debate with scrolls and ink. The stakes were literally life and death. The historical records are just staggering. One historian notes that in just a couple of years after Nicaea, the infighting between Christian groups was so violent, so brutal, that more Christians might have been killed by other Christians than by all the pagan persecutions in Roman history combined. Just let that sink in. This was a brutal, bloody war over the definition of God.
So how does this chaos finally end? Well, it doesn't end with everyone suddenly agreeing, holding hands, and reaching a beautiful theological consensus. No, it ends with the hammer of sheer imperial power. The debate was about to be silenced for good. The dogma was about to be finalized by force. There was one last piece to the puzzle. A group of theologians known as the Cappadocians, they came along and really refined the formula, especially when it came to the Holy Spirit. And this new theological work is what allowed the Council of Constantinople in 381 to officially affirm that the Holy Spirit was also divine. This was a huge step, and it's a concept that many historical sources point out hadn't really been clearly stated anywhere before, not even the scriptures. So, armed with this newly refined doctrine, the new emperor, Theodosius, decides to take the final, decisive step. He doesn't just give it a thumbs up, he makes it the law of the land. He issues an edict that orders all churches, all of them, to be handed over only to bishops who subscribe to this specific Trinitarian view.
And if that wasn't clear enough, a second edict followed, and this one laid out the punishment for disagreeing, and it was terrifying. Anyone who held a different view was now officially branded a foolish madman and a heretic. And they wouldn't just face potential punishment from God, they would face punishment from the Roman state. And just like that, the debate was over. Not because one side convinced the other, but because it was silenced by the force of law.
So, let's take a step back. What do we make of this centuries-long, messy journey? The historical analysis seems to paint a clear picture. This central doctrine wasn't just delivered from on high, fully formed. It was forged in the fires of a long, complicated, and very human process.
One historian, Dr. R.P.C. Hansen, puts it this way, and it really reframes the whole thing. He says this wasn't the story of people defending a truth they already had, it was the story of a search for a truth. A search that was conducted, as he says, by the method of trial and error.
And that leads to a pretty startling conclusion, summed up here by the Encyclopedia Americana, that the doctrine finalized in the 4th century wasn't just a clarification of what early Christians taught, it was, in their words, a deviation from this teaching.
And all of this leaves us with a really critical question to think about. If this foundational doctrine was, as the history suggests, forged over centuries of debate, political maneuvering, and imperial force, well, what does that imply about all the other beliefs and doctrines that were built on top of it? And that is a question we'll start to unpack next time. Thanks so much for joining us for this explainer.